L'argomento che tratteremo
The topic we're going to talk about today is the assembling of classical cakes. It will be a video class especially concentrated on manuality, where we will also talk about concepts that we already talked about. So we explained the most important criteria and most important passages. We'll also try to talk about the main problems that we can together analyze to then have all of our reference points to avoid, to make mistakes that in other circumstances we wouldn't have done. The first preparation we're going to see today is how to roll out short crust pastry. We're going to cover and coat a cake mold. We're going to fill it in with an apricot jam, and we're going to finish the assembling of our pie, and we will directly bake it. At the end of the cooking, we'll take it out of the oven and we will let it cool down to make it shiny. We can use some ready bases that usually have fruity apricot notes, or we can simply make a syrup 30 degrees Baume. So we're just letting it cool and brush it on the surface, and this is especially needed to give more appeal to our pie for our client. So we're going to make it shiny to amplify the visual effect. We're going to see the bases that we need. As we said, apricot jam out of the oven is fundamental, especially during the cooking phases, because this is conceived, adding some other products inside, it is conceived to avoid destroying boiling, so it is an oven suitable apricot jam. And we're going to use maybe artisanal jam or a spread raw jam to be eaten raw, since we have a lot of boiling. At the end of the cooking, we might notice some void areas on the surface. Instead, using oven-suitable marmalade, it is conceived to be able to be further cooked or baked in the oven. So what we will see is what we're going to notice as a linear surface after the cooking. And this is one thing. Always remember that if you're using a pastry bag with a smooth nozzle, avoid to have bases with pieces of dry fruit inside. Then we have our short crust. We're going to use a sablé short crust. So we use a mixture of around 58% of fats in proportion to the flour. Flour, cold butter. It's summer right now, so cold butter out of the fridge. The insertion is around 10 degrees, so flour, butter, salt and aromas, orange and lemon. We're going to let them sand out. We're going to waterproof. And then sifted icing sugar, 10 to 12 seconds, and then eggs and salt. And we're going to close our product. Blast chiller or fridge to rest, and then we're going to be left with this. We have our cake mold with butter and flour. I prefer, when it's possible, to use butter and flour with this type of molds. Clearly, if we have a silicone mold or we're using some rings to cook our pie, we don't need to grease a lot. Or maybe if we have a ring mold, same thing, we can open it and mold our base. In this case, it's fundamental to use butter and flour. Sprayed butter is much more practical, a lot cheaper, but it tends to overload the cooking of the external part. One broken egg to be brushed on top of the pie. And eventually flour. So we're going to unwrap our pastry. It will be quite hard, so the first thing we have to do is soften it. If we roll it out right now, It happens that in the external part we will have a lot of humidity, as you can see from my hands. And so this same humidity, when we will roll out, could really influence the flour, so it might create clumps. So what we're going to do is pushing. This will be needed to soften the butter. If you see some breakages, it's nothing serious, don't worry. We will try to soften it to have in the whole surface the same temperature. Don't put any flour in this phase, otherwise when we will press, the flour will enter inside. And we don't want this now. Clearly do it quite quickly, and as we go, let's start doing this pressing. Since we have to make a round base, we're going to shape it more or less roundish. From now, what we're going to do is we're going to take our dusting flour and we're going to dust both the base and the surface, and we're tapping it to distribute the flour, rolling it out, stopping, and always moving. This is because, as we already explained in some occasions, we are going to push fats and water with the pressure of the rolling pin, and if we leave it there, we will have a lot of resistance and attaching. Of course, when you'll make a lot in your laboratory, you will use a dough sheeter, which is a lot more practical. They have some rules with materials that are quite non-adherent, so you won't need to use so much dusting flour. We're going to try to lay it out in a way so that we have the dimension, based on the dimension of our cake mold, we know how to move, always touching the perimeters to understand if it's going on nicely. Notice one important thing. You can see that in the external part there are no breakages. This is important because breaking might expand when we put it in the cake mold. That's why we compacted it and smoothed it at the beginning, to avoid any breakages that are going to exaggerate when we're going to lift it with our hands. So always use your hands to understand if the surface is completely even. Now we're going to take our base, we're going to move it, I'm going to put our cake mold, and we're going to do this very quickly, lifting like this. Then we're going to cut, and only later, of course, removing the residues to make the surface slices. Remember that as you're assembling the remaining parts of our short crust, if you notice that they are overheating, maybe push them, put them in a foil, blast chill them, and let them stabilize. From here, we're going to put our hands like this, So you're just touching, you're not really pressing too much. Very slightly doing this. So why is this so important? It's important because when we're going to do this, even though it seems like it's not so, we're going to fix part of the air between the short crust and the cake mold. That same air during the cooking will tend to disturb the cooking of the pie, creating some evaporation that might create some bubbles. So we must be careful. Never trim the borders right away. Remember that from what you're seeing, so the thickness of the sides, what you see from raw will be around 25% less after the cooking. So don't think about what you have now, but what you will obtain later. We're going to take our jam. Remember that jam, if it's too little, it might be way too dry. It will tend to dry out a lot. If it's too much, it might be overpowering. So we must put a quantity that's coherent to the tasting of our client. So adding our jam. I'm going at around 1 centimeter thickness. Removing our pastry bag, and from here what we're going to do is we're going to take a spatula, a scraper, or a spoon, and we're just slightly evening the surface out, even though during the cooking it will tend to spread anyways. But we're doing this because when we will put the slices on top of short crust, they will follow the shape of the surface of the jam. So we prefer to smooth it out very slightly. So it is not a too big base, so we don't need to use a big tool. From here, we're going to very slightly trim the sides. In the beginning, to have the right measurement, always do it a little at a time because you can always remove. But if you cut too much, you can't go back. Always try to watch in the sides, in the cross parts. Always remember not to have too much border in proportion to the marmalade. You just have that quantity that will fall down during the cooking. If there's too much, when we will cut, the border part will crumble. Moving our base, and we're going to finish with our top slices. So rolling it out always the same way, so turning it around on one side and the other so that all of the imperfections that you obtain are going to be evened out. Now we're removing the imperfect part and we're going to cut our slices. Now remember, the thicker, the wider, narrower, this is really personal. We're going to take our eggs and we're going to brush the perimeter of the pie to allow the slices to better adhere. So just placing them, placing like this. And again. Before you fix them, control that the distancing between them is quite correct. Then what you're going to do is you're going to push. It'll open nicely on the base of the marmalade. Then we're going to cut some excess and pushing down the attachment part. Leave it nice and soft, because you always have to think about the shrinking of the base during the cooking. And we're going to finish some egg on top. Always put in them, don't pull too much. Let's control that they are placed nicely. So removing the excess and pushing. So don't pull too much. Turning around, same thing on the other side. Let's put some egg on top here too. And this, apart from letting them adhere nicely, will allow us to improve the cooking in the oven. We will have an external part that's more bronze. Perfect. And with this, we're finished with the assembling part of our classical pie, crostata with apricot jam, around 30 minutes of cooking at 170 degrees, valve at 40%, after which we're going to let it cool and we will unmold it. And we're going to make it shiny with either a 3B syrup or a fruity gelatin.